Okay, so this video is going to show you how to find producer and consumer surplus when you're dealing with a price floor. But the concepts that you're going to use in it can really be seen in almost any example where you're moving off of equilibrium and you're trying to find consumer and producer surplus. So to get started, you have to draw your initial axes. You have to label them properly, price and quantity. Sorry for my terrible handwriting, but there's our demand curve. There's our supply curve. Now at equilibrium, here is our equilibrium price. And here's our equilibrium quantity. To find consumer and producer surplus, you go, well, for consumer surplus first, you go for the price that consumers pay, the y-axis, and the demand curve. That whole area that I'm shading in right now, that is consumer surplus, that whole triangle. You can quantify it by finding the area of that triangle. Now, in order to find producer surplus, it's basically the mirror image. So you take the price producers receive, which at equilibrium is equilibrium, the y-axis, and the supply curve. So this area that is white right now, that I'm labeling PS, that is producer surplus. So that's how you find it normally. When you get knocked off of equilibrium, you will have to change that up a bit. So let's clear this and draw a new graph. There's our price, there's our quantity, there's our demand curve, there's our supply curve. If we have an effective price floor, that's going to be our example today. If we have an effective price floor, that should be set above equilibrium. So if you're setting above equilibrium, you draw a dotted line above that, and that is our price floor. So that means that consumers can't pay can't pay less than what is put at that price. So if that is our price floor, consumers are paying that price. So the price consumers pay is the price floor. To find the consumer surplus, you do that price up the y-axis and the demand curve. So just the same way we found consumer surplus before, you find it here. Only now we're not on equilibrium, we're at the price consumers pay, which is at the price floor. So that area I'm going to label consumer surplus. Where we run into some issues now is producer surplus. It's not found exactly the same way as we found it before, but the concept is similar. So here we have to remember that we don't sell beyond this quantity. That is our floor quantity. We don't sell beyond that quantity because nobody wants to buy more than that quantity at that price. So since we don't sell beyond that quantity, it affects our producer surplus. Now the price producers receive with a price floor is set right there, still at the price floor. The y-axis didn't move and the supply curve didn't move. But now, instead of going all the way to the equilibrium point, we stop at our quantity. So that trapezoid that I am filling in now, this whole thing is our producer surplus. So all of that area that I'm shading in is producer surplus. So what we can do when we look at this, we can see that consumer surplus shrank because it used to be the area that you see my cursor going over now. That used to be consumer surplus before the price floor. Now it's this little triangle. So consumer surplus, in other words, consumer well-being, shrank. Producer surplus, however, grew. Producer surplus used to be this area that I'm outlining with my cursor. It used to be that area, but now it's the area shaded in, and that is larger. Now you might be thinking, well, what about this area that I'm going over now? What happened to that? Well, that is now something that we will title deadweight loss. Deadweight loss is essentially a measurement of lost transactions that could have occurred. In other words, it's our inefficiency that's put in because we have a price floor. So when we're looking at this, we have to think, well, who is better, who is worse off? And what we can say is consumers are worse off, which makes sense. Producers are better off, which also makes sense since this is meant to help out producers. And society as a whole, if measured in terms of efficiency, is also worse off because our total surplus, which is consumer plus producer surplus, has shrank by the amount of the deadweight loss. And that's it for how you find all of these things when you have a change to equilibrium, price, and quantity. When you have that, when you're pushed off of that equilibrium, your analysis to this should always be similar to this. Always think what price consumers pay to the y-axis to the demand curve, only going up to the quantity, and then the price producers receive to the y-axis to the supply curve, only going up to the quantity. That is how you find all of those always. That's always going to be how you find consumer producer surplus. And total surplus will always just be the addition of those two, and deadweight loss will be whatever is left over when that hasn't been sold.